And I want to take our time together to talk about unmasking addiction and looking at it from a biblical standpoint. The goals here this morning are actually more polemic than they are pastoral. You'll have many pastoral applications in the workshops to come and in the other general sessions. But my overarching goal here this morning really is twofold. One is to dislodge confidence in the current myth that addiction is a disease. And I want to do that by bringing to you some statements by leaders in the research world. When I was working on my doctorate at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, my writing project, the dissertation, was on equipping volunteers in a local church addiction recovery program. And it was a great joy to research what is going on in the addiction world, in the secular world, and to see that many in the research world reject the disease model of addiction. And I want to bring you some of their testimonies this morning. And I want to also reinforce that science, rightly interpreted, never contradicts the Word of God. And I'm grateful for our science faculty here and for their loyalty to the Scriptures. And then a little bit of pastoral work right on the end. I want to provide a basic understanding of the voluntary slavery of sin. And that's a phrase that I learned from Ed Welch in his book, Addiction, Banquet in the Grave, and just a tremendous work. So I want to spend a little time this morning on that topic. In the first workshop, I will be talking what God is doing in a local church, in our church, through Freedom That Lasts. It's a ministry that my wife and I started in our church 10 years ago. And as Sam said, in the last several weeks, we've had over 100 every Friday night that we're ministering to there, and God is just doing some wonderful things. This is a picture taken just a couple of weeks ago, a picture of partial crowd. Our pastor was addressing them on why the church is important in this whole ministry of helping people overcome addiction. And it's wonderful to be a part of a church that just loves men and women who just need Jesus' love, and they need the gospel. And it is an exciting thing to see what's happening there. I want to start with a common definition. You'll see this just about everywhere you turn in the literature. This is by the American Society of Addictive Medicine, and it says it is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, environment, and an individual's life experiences. One secular author said you could say that's the definition of romance as well. It is a complex interaction among brain circuits, genetics, environment, and an individual's life experiences. So actually, that's not a real helpful definition of what addiction truly is, but that's kind of the cultural definition. And there are perceived advantages for the disease model of addiction in the world. One is it seems to explain how addiction feels. If you have a stomach virus, you may feel like losing your lunch. And you can't help it. It just is a part of the thing, and because you have a medical problem. And addiction certainly can feel that way, that you just have to do something. But as we'll learn throughout these 2 days, that is not entirely the case. The disease model also attempts to socially destigmatize addiction. We don't fuss at somebody. We don't say they got a deep sin problem if they have a broken leg or if they have cancer or something. And so the world likes to look at addiction as a disease because it destigmatizes it. Now, that doesn't mean that addiction doesn't have many physical consequences. Thirdly, it points to a medical treatment for the solution. And what is interesting when you look at the literature on this, 85% of the facilities, addiction facilities and clinics in the U.S., these are not the faith-based ones, but the rest of them, 85% of them use Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps as their recovery model, which is not a medical treatment at all. In fact, the evidence-based results of studies on addiction, Alcoholics Anonymous with the 12-step program is that it has between a 5 and 10% success rate. That's the evidence-based success rate. So we have 85% of the facilities in the US using a treatment program that is non-medical but only has a 5 or 10% success rate. And so the Bible offers us much, much more. And the results are much, much greater. And calling it a disease also authorizes insurance payments for treatment facilities and practitioners, and it does permit financial grant benefits for scientific research. So I want to share with you some of these dissenting voices of addiction. This is Stanton Peele. He is a PhD, a psychologist, and also an attorney. He's been writing in this field for about 50 years now. And he's an addiction expert, investigator for 5 decades. The Atlantic magazine said he's one of 10 people who are revolutionizing how we study addiction and recovery. He's written about a dozen books and many articles. His most recent book, just come out in 2019, is called Outgrowing Addiction. And what I want to point out here that you'll hear reinforced in some of these other research folks is that they see the movement out of addiction as the ongoing growth and development of a person beyond needing a drug to solve a problem, that he grows to learn other strategies and other things. Well, sanctification is also growth, but a much more robust growth dealing with the whole man. And so therefore it is a much better treatment, if I can use those words. But it's interesting, in this research field, they're talking about the development of the human being and the growth of the human being as the solution to addiction, and not treating it as a medical disease. He says in this book, what determines whether or not drug use escalates into addiction, and the prognosis once it has, is less to do with the power of the drug and more to do with the social, personal, and economic circumstances of the user. And many of the research will say the reason people stay in drugs, even though many drugs have very powerful a pull on their lives and strong cravings, and of course once they're addicted to some drugs, they fear the coming out of that drug, and so they keep taking the drug so they don't have to go through the pain of withdrawal. But even with all of that struggle of the drug itself, the greatest thing that keeps somebody in addiction is that he doesn't have a better life to live apart from the drug or the alcohol. He said people don't become addicted to opiates as a rule because they have other purposes in their lives with which using the drug interferes. For example, if your grandmother goes into, I say that, but I'm one of those grandparents. But if your grandmother goes into the hospital for hip surgery, and let's say there's some complications, and maybe she's on extended use of morphine or some pain meds, some opiates. In most cases, grandma doesn't come out a junkie. But she's been using that drugs on a daily basis, sometimes for weeks if there's a complicated surgery. She may come out loopy, but she doesn't come out a junkie. And the reason is because the drug is now, once she gets out of the hospital, the drug is interfering with the life she wants to get back to. She wants to get back to the grandkids, and she wants to get back to the cooking and her family and her friends and all of those sort of things. And the drug is now interfering with that. That was also borne out in a study that was done in the 1970s that almost everybody in the addiction literature quotes. In the 1970s, our men went overseas in the Vietnam War, and I believe the statistics are something like within just weeks, 50% of the men were using heroin and opium on a regular basis for their entire tour of duty. And the reason is because it was such a depressing environment and so many noxious things going on, and war is a horrible thing. And they tracked those men when they came back, and 90% of the 50% were addicted. 90% of those stopped using heroin instantly and never relapsed. Because again, the drug interfered with what they wanted to get back to. They wanted to get back to their families. They wanted to get back to their work and their bowling leagues and their sports and their buddies and all of that sort of thing. It served a purpose when their environment was one they didn't want to be around, but when they got home, the drug interfered with that and they dropped it. And that's what Stanton Peele is referring to here as well. He has a book called Addiction Proof Your Child. By the way, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as the best book on this. Mark Shaw's book on parent proofing, addiction proofing your child is, I think, the best one available, but this is a secular work. But he says, recovery is not the result of magically leaving something behind. It is about embracing life and expanding your horizons. There is no better way to fight addiction. And men and women, this is where the local church comes in. Because at our church, we can love people. They've burned their relational bridges and their family ties, and they've lost their jobs, and they've lost their homes, and they've lost, and they might have a felony on their record, and they can't get jobs. And they come into a community of people who love them and who help provide jobs for them and who disciple them and work with them. And the world doesn't know anything about that. They can kind of teeter around on the edges of that, as Stanton Peele is doing here, but there's no better place for that connection to happen than the local church. He said the way out of addiction is to develop a range of skills and engage fully in life. And so a lot of addiction recovery programs rightly deal with how to manage your finances and prepare a job resume and all of those sorts of things. But what the secular world cannot give is the real wisdom or the skill of living. And we'll talk about that as we go along here this morning. One of his earlier books is called The Meaning of Addiction, An Unconventional View. And this is when he began bucking the mainstream. I think this was written back in 1988. He had a couple other books before this. But he said, extensive research shows that addiction cannot be resolved biologically, even with methadone and other things. He said, lived human experience and its interpretation. And all of us are interpreters. And he'll have another quote, or somebody else has another quote we'll look at in just a little bit. But he said, lived human experience and its interpretation are central to the incidence, course, treatment, and remission of addiction. The idea that new genetic or neurochemical discoveries will eliminate this irrefutable truth is the greatest of all myths about addiction. Only the Bible, only God Himself can help us interpret rightly what we go through. Our losses and the hurts that come as a result of other people, and all of the struggles of living on a fallen planet, only the Bible teaches us how to interpret that. And he is saying it's lived human experience and its interpretation that is the key here. Another specialist in this field is Arnold Ludwig. He's a psychiatrist, again, written many years ago. The book I'm going to refer to in a minute was also written back in 1988. He is currently adjunct professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University School of Medicine, professor emeritus at Department of Psychiatry, University of Kentucky Medical School. When he was teaching at the University of Kentucky, he did extensive interviews and following case studies of alcoholics, hundreds and hundreds of men and women, and noting their case studies and trying to find the themes that are going through their lives and their experiences. He's also a former professor and chair of that Department of Psychiatry, University of Kentucky College of Medicine. His book is called Understanding the Alcoholic's Mind, the Nature of Craving and How to Control It. And so he's going to examine all of the scripts, the way people think about things. And of course, he's just using a cognitive re-scripting of a person's brain. But he goes to great lengths to show here's how an addict thinks. He says the nature of the urge or compulsion to drink depends on the predominant way each individual thinks. And that's why God begins our transformation after the gospel with the renewing of our minds by the Word of God. He said the first thing alcoholics must do is recognize, and by the way, not just alcoholics, if you understand the sinful nature that lives within you, all of us have this problem. The first thing alcoholics must do is recognize how clever, persistent, and seductive their minds can be at providing them with justification to drink. We are all very creative people in justifying what we want to do. I would have when I was dean of students here for about 30 years, I'd have somebody come in and say, I'm just not a creative person. I said, I don't believe that I'm dean of students here. I watch how people sin for 30 years. They can be incredibly creative, and so can I, in coming up with what we want to do, and then a creative way of doing it, and a creative way of covering it up. We are incredibly creative people. By the way, when he talks about interpretation, sometime if you want some interesting clips to watch Viktor Frankl on YouTube talk about the Holocaust. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. I think he's deceased now. He was a secular Jew, and but he made a study while he was in the death camps of watching why some people gave up and why some people didn't. There were many who didn't have any choice in that, of course, but those who survived and just didn't give up living he said they had purpose and meaning, and they had a way of interpreting all of the evil that came their way. Well, again, the scriptures is the only reliable source of how to interpret all of that. He says, typical of the thought processes, and by the way, this is true of all of us, typical of the thought processes of alcoholics here he's speaking of, are tendencies to feel sorry for themselves. Does that get any takers here? You know, I can have pity parties and invite people to come to the party. You know, bring the cake and the punch, you know. Or tendencies to feel sorry for themselves, to blame others for whatever goes wrong, to nurse grievances, to be preoccupied with petty concerns, to dwell on the past, to keep imagining the worst, to feel alienated from others, to shirk responsibilities, to overreact to frustrations, to act impulsively, and to become obsessed with immediate pleasures. That's our entire culture, men and women. And he said this is a foundational, these are some of the justifications in the way they think and why they're susceptible to a mood-altering experience or substance. He said these mental scripts all share one feature in common. They reflect a basic discontent or unhappiness with the way things are imagined to be, have been, or will be. I say frequently on Friday night, you need to really watch. If you start complaining and whining and murmuring, you're headed for a fall. We fall when we get discontent and we think something else ought to be different. And he said it is difficult enough for recovering alcoholics to stay dry, but when they constantly believe that something is wrong or amiss in their lives, then they continue to remain susceptible to the instant, easy solutions that alcohol has to offer. And by the way, he says, you know, one of the problems of our day is that alcohol, because it's legal, because alcohol is legal, it is accessible and acceptable in our society. And when people don't have solution, and people are familiar with the little buzz they get from it, and when they have major problems, it's accessible and acceptable, and they start drinking to solve their problems. My concern is all of that is becoming a major part of the church. As the church increasingly grows to the point where alcohol is accessible and acceptable, and we have young people and men and women in our church who are biblically illiterate and don't know how to solve their problems with wisdom, they're going to turn to those drugs and alcohol as well. He closes out his book with this statement: all the techniques expressed in this book represent the building blocks for successful recovery, but what eventually cements them together is the commitment to an emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually fulfilling life. This is a hallmark of true sobriety. With this orientation to life, intoxication is unnecessary. I frequently say at Freedom at Last, when I'm talking to the newcomers, the folks who are there for the first time, that you will hear us talk very little about sobriety here. Although we rejoice when somebody in a testimony part says, I've been sober 3 weeks or 2 years or whatever it is, we rejoice in those things. But I say our goal is far more than sobriety, because you can be sober and miserable. You can be sober and a thief. You can be sober and immoral. But you can't be like Jesus and be any of those things. So our whole program here is helping you learn how to be like Jesus. Because mature Christians do sin, are tempted to sin, and mature Christians do sin, but no mature Christian is dominated and enslaved to a sin. Because mature Christians know how to handle trials and they know how to handle troubles. It doesn't mean that they handle them immediately well right off, but the goal is Christian maturity. We want to become grown-up Christians. We want to handle life like Jesus. Another dissenting voice is Bruce Alexander, psychologist, researcher, author, professor emeritus at Simon Fraser University, Canada. Very famous for his rat park experiments that I'll talk to you about in a minute, in the 1970s. And he's also an avowed atheist and socialist. Back in the 60s, when, drugs and addiction have been around for centuries. But in the 60s, with the hippie movement coming in and the sexual revolution and the cultural revolution at that time, many, many more people began experimenting with drugs and speed and LSD and psychedelic drugs and other things, as well as heroin. And so, and most of these men were in college or were at that time, and so we're very familiar with how that movement began. I was in high school in the 60s. I was a hippie wannabe, and there's a lot of that life that appealed to me. And I walked away from the Lord and from my parents for a period of time. But in a weak moment, I promised my mom and dad I'd go to a Christian college for a year. And I was too proud to go back on my word. And so when I graduated from high school, I came to Bob Jones to do my 1-year time in this maximum security facility. And then when I was paroled, I was going to go back home and pick up where I left off. I didn't, in those years, I didn't come home a lot of nights and was getting into trouble. And God just revolutionized my life here at Bob Jones. Changed me into a different person. And it was the Word of God preached and taught and lived out in front of me that made a huge difference in my life. I will forever be grateful. I remember standing on that bridge my freshman year thinking, Jim Berg, Bob Jones, you shouldn't even put those those two names in the same sentence. That's an oxymoron like Microsoft Works. They don't go together. And I thought there's only one reason why I'm at Bob Jones and not in jail. It's a God in heaven that loves me. He's given me another chance. That's what the gospel does. That's what sanctification. I was a believer, but I was a very rebellious one. But sanctification does that. Well, Bruce Alexander, going back to the 60s, the researchers began saying, why the pull of these drugs? And so they would take rats like this and put them in their little cages with just a door like this in front, and the rats couldn't see each other in the next cage. So basically, except watching the laboratory assistants, these rats were in solitary confinement. And they gave them the choice of drinking water or drinking for hydration or drinking heroin water. It had a little heroin in it with a little sugar because heroin's a little bit bitter. And it wasn't long before these rats were drinking the heroin constantly. So the conclusion was, the wrong interpretation was, it's the drug that makes a person addicted. And Bruce Alexander came along and he said, but rats don't live in solitary confinement. They run around in groups. And so he developed what famously began to be called Rat Park. And in one of the labs, he created this L-shaped alley for these rats to play with. He took the same rats out of those cages that were supposedly addicted to the heroin, put them in here, and they ran around and they played with the tin cans and dug around and everything and made babies and do all the things that happy rats do, and gave them the same choice of the water or the heroin water, and they didn't take the heroin. And he concluded the reason they didn't take the heroin, there was no reason to take it. If you're in solitary confinement, you want heroin. But if you're out doing what you're created to do, he didn't call it creation, but you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, then you don't need the drug. And that became a very, very famous experiment. In his book, just published a few years ago, this is called The Globalization of Addiction, a story of poverty in the spirit. For an atheist borrowing something from the Sermon on the Mount, that's kind of interesting. But he says, today's rising tide of addiction to drug use and 1,000 other habits is the consequence of people, rich and poor alike, being torn from the close ties of family, culture, and traditional spirituality that constituted the normal fabric of pre-modern times. And he calls this dislocation. We call it estrangement. God made us to function in our ideal state, which we're going to reach one day in heaven, of loving God and our neighbor with our whole heart. And you tear away a man from God and his neighbor and isolate him, and you have somebody who is going to want to dull that pain of that existence. Another author, and the last one that I'll introduce to you today, is Mark Lewis. He is a developmental psychologist and neurobiologist. He's a professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands, a developmental psychologist, neuroscientist. He's author and a contributing author, speaker, and blogger on addiction-related topics. His first major work was called The Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. And he was a college student at Yale, again in the 60s. And got into the drug scene and actually flunked out of Yale and went traveling around the world and trying to find a meaning and purpose in life. And the book is very raw because of the kind of life he lived. But he finally one day said, this is not the way I want to live my life. And I've got to find out why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so he went back to college and got a developmental psychologist degree, PhD, and then began doing work as a neuroscientist as well with further training. And he has a book, his key book is called The Biology of Desire. If you want a fascinating synopsis of this, go to YouTube and just search for The Biology of Desire, Mark Lewis, and you'll find several instances of that as he speaks around the world. The subtitle of the book is Why Addiction is Not a Disease. And he says calling addiction a disease is not only inaccurate, it's often harmful. Brain disease may be used as a metaphor for how addiction seems or feels, but it's not a sensible explanation for how addiction works. And he says addiction results from the motivated repetition of the same thoughts and behaviors until they become habitual. And he talks about how the brain reinforces that. He says in the next quote here, medical researchers are correct that the brain changes with addiction. You'll hear about drugs rewire the brain. Our choices to repeat a behavior that has a high emotional content to it is what rewires our brain, and it's called learning. He said medical researchers are correct that the brain changes with addiction, but the way it changes has to do with learning and development, not disease. And the dopamine enters into that. Of course, the drugs excite dopamine and gives it that high emotional experience. And it is that high emotional experience of a repeated behavior that the brain says, and I'm paraphrasing here, the brain says, okay, boss. It's interesting, Mark Lewis says, your brain is not addicted, folks. You are addicted. He said, we don't know what you is, but the you in you is addicted, not your brain. Your brain only helped the you do what you want to do. And you keep choosing this experience with a high emotional part of it, and the brain says, hey, we'll go for that. And we'll help you with that. And we'll even shut down the rational part of your brain so it doesn't interfere with that so much. And he said that this is why you can take MRIs of couples madly in love and having a lot of sex, and take MRIs of them, and their MRIs are identical to heroin user MRIs. But we don't say they have a disease of romance and love. But the brain is reacting to the same thing to repeated experiences that have high emotional content. And in fact, if that couple is not married, and you're trying to convince them that this is dangerous for them, I mean, we're going to use the Word of God to show why it's wrong, but you can't talk any sense into them. Just like you can't talk sense into an addict who's in the middle of this, because part of the prefrontal cortex is being taken offline. It's being pruned. To assist, the body is assisting the heart to do what the heart decides. And God designed, Ed Welch back in 1981 wrote a book called The Counselor's Guide to the Brain and Its Disorders, distinguishing between sin and disease. A marvelous book, and very technical in the brain work. That's part of his doctoral work. And it was a phenomenal book. It went out of print, and he I think it was 1991, I think he did that book, and then 1999, I think it was, he put out a smaller version, more accessible to laymen, called Blame It on the Brain. And it's distinguishing between chemical imbalance, sin, and disease. And one of the premises of that book, it's just phenomenal, is that God designed our body to serve our heart. Our heart, our soul calls the shots. Our body simply mediates that. It does that in covert ways through the learning processes of the brain and habituation. It does that through the endocrine system, through the fight or flight response of the autonomic nervous system. It does it in overt ways. If I want to pick up this piece of paper, my heart decides that's what I want to do. My body mediates that, and I pick up this piece of paper. God made this body, which includes the brain, to serve the heart. That's why we must guard our hearts with all diligence. Out of it come all of these issues of life. And that, and that's why you cannot just treat addiction by somehow treating the body. It's the heart that's making the decisions to handle life this way. He goes on to say, people have referred to addiction as a habit throughout recent history. That's just what it is. It's a nasty, often relentless habit, a serious habit, an expensive habit. But what makes it so enduring, so relentless, so difficult to change? What makes it different from what we might call more benign habits? All of us developed a habit of tying our shoes at one point. I tied my shoes this morning, but I don't remember that, but I'm sure I did. I'm sure my wife didn't tie them for me. And not that she wouldn't if I was incapacitated, but it's not a particularly exhilarating experience. It may have been when I was 4. I do it every day. I tie my shoes, but I don't. It hasn't become an addiction because there's no exhilaration that goes with it. It doesn't alter my moods. So he said 3 things make that the case. First, it is a habit of thinking and feeling, a mental habit. This is a domain of the soul, men and women. Only God tells us what we need to be thinking and what we need to be desiring. It's not just a behavioral habit. Second, the feeling part of addiction always includes a feeling of desire, which is, of course, the theme of this book. And we're going to look at James 1:14 and 15 in just a few minutes. God says, every man is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his desires. We want something out of whatever we are doing. And third, it's a habit that becomes compulsive. Perhaps all habits once formed are compulsive to some degree. The brain is certainly built to make any action repeated enough times into a compulsion. But the emotional heart of addiction, in a word, desire, makes compulsion inevitable. And repetition is the key to compulsion. To understand addiction, we need to see it as the outcome of a normally functioning brain, not a diseased brain. Still, we must acknowledge that it's an extreme outcome, and that's what has to be explained. And he spends a good bit of time in the book. And if I had my life to do over again, I could do what I want. I'd be a biblical counselor with a medical degree. I love reading these kinds of things, and he's got many chapters here giving you an understanding of how different parts of the brain work together. And we still know very little about the brain, but enough to understand how the brain actually reinforces the choices that our hearts make. It's a fascinating study. So what are the disadvantages of the disease model? Well, it's not universally accepted in the research world. It has a lot of traction for a couple of reasons. One is the human heart wants to justify itself that it's not responsible for something. And secondly, and I hate to say it this way, but there's a lot of money in the addiction industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. If you want an expose of that, go to Amazon Prime and get the video, The Business of Recovery. It's a fascinating expose and documentary on the recovery movement. But and you have to keep that myth of medical problem that it's chronic and you'll have it the rest of your life, because that keeps beds filled and clinics filled, because you're going to need us all of your life. As long as this is a chronic disease that you can't overcome, you can just manage it. And it removes all hope. Did you know the research literature shows that the most characteristic, distinguishing factor that will guarantee ongoing addiction is the belief of the addict that he has a disease? That is the single most predictor that he will stay addicted, because it removes any hope that there's a way out of this. And the addiction model, the disease model, cannot explain the successes medically. How do you explain all these rats not going back to the heroin? How do you explain all these Vietnam vets not going back to the heroin? How do you explain that whatever successes there are in the AA movement are not medical things at all? In fact, 50% of addicts who get into addiction of one sort or another recover, sometimes 10 or 15 years later, but recover without treatment. That's 50%. How do you explain that medically? That's not true of cancer. That 50%, if they do nothing, will just recover. And it ignores man's real problem, and we should expect the world to try to mask this. And that is man's attempts to make life work without God. So just to recap some of these takeaways. Addictions most often rise when problem solving fails. God made the body to serve the heart. I already mentioned that. Choices of the heart are reinforced by the body chemically and neurologically. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing God has designed. The body, or the brain, and the brain is part of the body, once trained by a misguided heart, a heart that's wanting something that is going to be destructive for him, has to be untrained and retrained by a renewed heart, one whose commitments, desires, and beliefs are molded by God through His Word, by His Spirit, and that's called sanctification. And the last thing I want to remind us about is that believers never have to be afraid of science rightly interpreted. True science will never contradict the Bible. So, addressing it biblically, I'm just going to do a little piece of pastoral work here on this and leave the scientific world for just a moment. A biblical worldview provides the only accurate description of the nature of man's soul and its problems. The problem with all of these scientific studies is, while some people like Mark Lewis may acknowledge there's something immaterial going on, we don't know what it is, we don't know what the mind is, and we don't know what is going on, but there's something beyond just the body. But science has to ignore all of that and just deal with the body. And that's why they're always going to come to the wrong conclusions, because you have to factor in the fact that man is an image bearer of God, but he's fallen. Man can flourish as his Creator intended only. And this is for all of us, men and women. You and I can flourish. I love that word, flourish. It just is a blossoming kind of word. Thrive. We use the word thrive in many ways, but I love the word flourishing. Man can flourish as his Creator intended only as he is reconciled to God and his mind, will, and emotions are transformed by the renewing of his mind, the renewing of his soul. And that's true of all of us. We must teach our children, our grandchildren, the people we disciple, our friends, that the only way to flourish is with a reconciled relationship with Jesus Christ and the transforming power of his word meditated upon, pursuing the likeness of God in our lives for his glory and with his help. It's not just a behavioral new habits. It is a transformation of who we are on the inside, and we do develop new habits as believers of thinking, and new habits of what we desire, and new habits of what we choose. And habits are a wonderful flywheel that God has given us. And we need to develop those spiritual disciplines that promote godliness in our lives. And that's what we do in Freedom at Last. It's all about the disciplines. Our Freedom at Last is kind of like adult Awanas. We memorize the Bible, we fill in blanks and do Bible studies, and we go to church, and we do service projects, and we do all of those things. Why? Because that's what normal Christianity is about. Addiction, I call it a dependency disorder. Man turning to himself to make life work and turning away from God. I think the most basic way to look at that, Jeremiah 2:13 says, God says, my people have committed two evils. The first evil is that they have forsaken me, the living God, at the fountain of living waters. And the second evil is that they've hewn out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. And there are just two options here. I am going to turn to God to quench my thirst and my desire, or I'm going to turn to myself and my own ways of getting that. In Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, a verse that many of us memorized when we were little children, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. And Romans 6 gives that dichotomy as well. As ye have yielded your members of your body as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin and to more lawlessness, now yield your members as instruments of righteousness unto God, unto holiness and more righteousness. And I call it a dependency disorder because addicts get that. They get the idea of dependency. And you are either depending on God to make your life work, or you're depending on yourself. And Isaiah 55 puts it this way: let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my ways are not your ways, saith the Lord. Neither my thoughts your thoughts. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts and your thoughts, and my ways than your ways. Those are the two options. And I bring men and women back to James 1:14 and 15 constantly. But every man is tempted. Every man, that's pretty exclusive. Every human being is tempted in this way, when he's drawn away, enticed by lies, drawn away by his own desires. He wants something. So if I'm going to help people, I want to find out what it is they want. I'm going to give you 4 lessons out of James 1:4 and 15, and then I'm going to quit. Lesson 1, behind every fall is a pull of our desires. I was talking to a young man at the Greenville Rescue Mission. He'd come to Freedom at Last a couple of times, and I was there for graduation for overcomers. And he came up to me and he said, Jim, he said, I don't understand this. He said, I'm clean from drugs right now, but he said, I do really miss marijuana. But he said, I'm not doing that right now. But he said, I don't understand this. You could put a whole pallet of cocaine or heroin bricks right next to me, and I would not be tempted to use them at all. Not the slightest. And he said, but I would be tempted to sell them. And he said, I don't understand what's going on. And I said, well, we have to figure out what is it you want. That's the desire. Every man is tempted who is drawn away of his own desires. So what is it? I said, what is it you want out of selling cocaine? He said, money. He said, I can make more money in one weekend than you can make in a year. I said, I don't doubt that. I'm in Christian education, No, we're taking care of you. But he said, I said, so what do you want out of the money? And instantly he said, I want a fast car and nice clothes. And he said, God's not against fast cars and nice clothes, is he? I said, well, not necessarily, but if you're selling cocaine to get it, he is. He said, okay, just take that off the table. And I said, okay, what is it that you want from the fast car and nice clothes? He said, I have never thought of that. And he thought for a few seconds and he said, respect. I want people to notice when I drive by. I want people to notice when I walk by. I want respect. And I said, until you get God's way of how you get respect, you will never overcome your temptation. Every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own desires. We have to help them find what those desires are. One way to do that is kind of take an inventory of emotions. Ask yourself and those you counsel, under what circumstances am I most likely to become angry? When you're angry, what is it you wanted that is unjustly withheld from you? Or came your way unjustly? Or when we become fearful, what is it that I'm fearful of losing that I want so badly? Or despair, what is it that I've come to the conclusion I will never get what I want? And we want to help people understand what their desires are. Is it a desire for control? Is it for recognition? Is it for power and glory and whatever? And we have to show them, here's how God says that issue is handled. And all the things that they're addicted to. A lot of people, they want to numb their brain because of all the stuff that's going on in their lives. You know what that is? That's a desire for some peace. God has a way to give peace. In Isaiah 55, God says, my word comes down from heaven and accomplishes what I pleases. And he says, when your ways become my ways, you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. All the mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing. In the Hebrew it says, the hills are alive with the sound of music. You can check it out. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing. God, he says, God's words, my ways in your soul will give you joy and peace. And the drugs are just a means of getting peace or joy, some exhilarating experience. Lesson 2, behind every fall is belief in a lie. Adam and Eve fell because they believed lies. They believed lies about God, about themselves, and about the way God's world works. So when I'm working with somebody, I want to find out what he wants. I also want to find out what he's believing about God and about himself and about the way God's world works. What principles is he operating life by? Behind every fall is a choice to obey God or to obey your own lusts. James 1 says, then when lust hath conceived, and the picture is of a husband and wife coming together in physical intimacy, and when my desire, which is if it's sinful, meets my will decides, and they wed together, then a sin is born. And that sin, as it matures, will bring forth death. I love the way Ken Collier, good friend, best friend, has said this years and years ago, decades ago. Just two choices on the shelf, pleasing God or pleasing self. And I want to keep it that simple, folks. That's where the choice is. It's between God. My fight isn't with a drug. The fight is with my own soul for the dominion of my own life. I want to call my own shots. And that's where we need to get to the heart of the trouble. It is easy going the pleasing self, but then life gets harder. It's harder pleasing God, and I don't think it ever becomes easy, but it becomes easier. And last lesson I want to leave with you is repeated sin always leads to the death or the loss of something. And as your notes say, essentially you seem to lose your ability to choose. That's where it comes in, where it says, it's like I can't help it. Choice seems to die, and addiction is born. Life seems to be driven by triggers and cravings. Although you're never without the ability to choose, it certainly feels as if you don't have a choice. You are losing your freedom. Certainly you lose your ability to choose the consequences of your actions. the death of your health as a consequence, the death of your employment, the death of your financial situation, the death of relationships, the death of your emotional well-being, and the death of hope. And the themes that you're going to hear constantly throughout this conference go along with these lines. It may not be said exactly this way, but God's recovery program is sanctification. And his support group is a local church. God wants men, I have seen this over the last 10 years, men and women who become active and participating members in the local church. And I really appreciate a lot of the guys coming out, overcomers. They'll join our church as they've been going to Freedom at Last. And one of the first things they say is there something I can do? And so we get them on parking lot duty, or some of them are singing in the choir. One of them's an usher, and just giving them, they're helping clean up after Friday night and they come early and help set up. And this is the way a body is to be operating with one another. God's support group is a local church. The men and women who have come through our program and don't get involved in a local church don't make it. It doesn't have to be our church, but it has to be a church that's Bible preaching and discipleship oriented and sanctification oriented.